Hi, I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. And this video looks at a question that really has a simple answer. And the answer is you can't answer this question for the buyer. Send them to legal counsel. But let's talk about why that's the answer. Buyer has been working with another broker. Buyer made an offer on the other house, and that's a detail that may or may not be true in every case, but buyer's been working with another broker, and for whatever reason, buyer is now unhappy with that broker and wants to use you instead. Let's assume for a moment, because this is the context of the question that was recently asked, that the buyer had in fact made an offer on a home utilizing that other broker, and it was a sale fail, or maybe the offer was never even accepted. I think that was the case. The offer was never even accepted. And now buyer wants to work with you instead. And the question is, can I represent this buyer? What if this buyer wants to buy the same house? What if the buyer wants to buy a different house? Can I represent this buyer? Are there ramifications to me or to the buyer or anybody else as a result of that? And the question asker in this specific situation did not know whether the buyer had a buyer agency agreement with their former broker or not. That's an important question to find an answer to. Remember, the ultimate answer to this question is you can't answer this question. You got to send that buyer to legal counsel. Why would I say that? Because if buyer has an existing contractual or other relationship with a broker that would obligate the buyer to pay compensation to that other broker, you can't get in the middle of that relationship. I hope that you recognize, as soon as I said contractual relationship, I hope the bells went off in your head that said, wait a minute, if I tell buyer what their rights or obligations are under an existing contract with somebody else, I'm probably giving them legal advice, because you would be. And brokers, you're not licensed or insured to do that. So that's why I say the ultimate question is you can't give buyer the answer to this question. But it's still an important question for you to work through, because probably what's really at the heart of the question for the broker who's asking the question is not, can I represent the buyer? The answer to that question is actually pretty simple. Yeah, you can represent the buyer, sure. And I don't even care if the buyer is represented by another broker. You can represent the buyer. That's not really the question the broker's asking, even though that was exactly the question the broker asked. What the broker's really asking is, will I be compensated if I represent the buyer in the purchase of this property or another piece of property? And I don't know the answer to that question. If the buyer has a buyer agency agreement with the other broker and the buyer breaches that contract by purchasing the property with you and not with the other broker, then you will probably earn compensation that's been offered from the seller through the MLS. But your buyer will also owe compensation to that other broker. That's certainly not what your buyer intends. Send your buyer to legal counsel for assistance with that. What if your buyer doesn't have a buyer agency agreement with that other broker? In that case, the other broker may have the factual basis for being able to assert that they are the procuring cause for receipt of the compensation offered by seller through the MLS to the broker who procures a buyer for that property. If the other broker succeeds in a procuring cause argument, then you're not going to get compensated, broker. The other broker is going to be compensated instead. Again, I can't tell you who's going to win a procuring cause argument on any set of facts, but certainly not when I'm provided no facts at all, which is buyer wrote an offer with another broker and now they want different representation. Can I help them? Even if you were to say, here's all the facts relevant to this transaction, I still couldn't answer that question. No lawyer could. Why? Because that question, if a procuring cause complaint is filed, that question is going to be answered by a panel of your peers put together by either your local realtor association or your local MLS, and that panel will decide whether or not the other broker was the procuring cause of this transaction, earning the compensation. So what about if this buyer wants to go buy something else? Set this property aside, they don't want this one anymore, they want to go buy something else. Can I represent them on that? Yeah, sure, you can represent them. But again, there's still that fundamental question of who's entitled to compensation. If the buyer has an existing buyer agency agreement with that other broker, they need to go talk to a lawyer about their rights and obligations under that existing buyer agency agreement. You can't answer that question for them. You're not licensed nor insured to do that. If they, though, want to go buy another piece of property and they have no buyer agency agreement with the other broker, so no written buyer agency agreement with the other broker, and they want to buy a piece of property that the other broker did not introduce to them. What do we mean by introduce to them? Well, it could be that the other broker showed them the property. It could be as simple as the other broker forwarding them an email through the MLS introducing the buyer to this property. That could alone be enough under a procuring cause theory to at least create the argument that that other broker is entitled to compensation. And certainly if there's a buyer agency agreement in place, that could be enough to award compensation from the buyer to the buyer broker. So again, the point of this video is not to answer this question for you substantively, because I can't, but instead to give you a lot of reasons to understand why you can't answer this question for the buyer who asks the question either. This buyer is in a contractual relationship to another broker. And when anybody is in a contractual relationship and wants to understand their rights and obligations under that contract, they need a lawyer to give them advice and not a real estate broker. You're not licensed and you're not insured to give that advice. Send that buyer to legal counsel. When their lawyer says, yes, you are free to work with another broker, you have no existing obligations to that first broker, then you're ready to work with them and receive compensation that's earned. Until then, make sure that you work within the parameters of whatever the advice is that their lawyer gives to them. And if they don't want to go talk to a lawyer about their existing obligations to the other broker, then recognize you are potentially at risk for not receiving compensation for the buyer's purchase of property, and the buyer is potentially at risk for owing compensation to two different brokers. If you have questions on this topic or any other, visit warealtor.org, follow the links to the legal hotline, and ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.